Good morning. How's everybody? Doing well. I'm glad you are because you won't answer, so I'm going to suppose you are. Thank you, Missy. You and Suzanne, y'all get A's. Oh, man. I've always tried to laugh and I've always found a sense of humor in just about everything. But I found a reason for that just this week or last week. There's a study out that says you live longer if you laugh every day. So I'll try it. I know it. No. Turn your Bibles to Romans 12. Romans 12. We're going to begin in verse 14. Are there any announcements that we need to make? Anything we need to know about? Glad to see young Miss Pat out. Good to see you. And you haven't wrestled with any chairs lately, have you? Well, that's good. We want to be mindful of everything's going on. Let me say this. I just thought of it, but let me say this. I We will finish Romans when we get finished, and it'll take us a couple more. It takes more than a couple more weeks, but it'll take us three or four, probably somewhere towards the end of December or first of the year, whatever. We'll go to a topical study for a little while, and I really don't have. I've got a list, and I can pull from any of that list of series that I can come up with. But if you have something you'd like for me to talk about for a little while, I'd be glad to. Just tell me, and we'll see. We'll entertain whether it's one lesson or five or 10. Doesn't matter. But you'll tell me. I'll be glad to see what we can do about that. And in Romans chapter 12, we finally hit the practical side of Romans, and it is. I love Romans, appreciate what it means, what it says, what it's all about. But when you get to the 12th chapter, you get to that practical aspect. You talk about really how to live your life as a Christian in chapter 12, chapter 13, government, chapter 14, matters of indifference, who's right, who's wrong, what do we do with regards to things that are matters of opinion as opposed to doctrine. 16th chapter is one that deals with really just kind of a goodbye, see you later. But there's two or three really good thoughts. It's all good. I don't mean that, but just really deep thoughts that I want us to really hone in on when we get to the 16th chapter as we close out the book. But in this 12th chapter, we talk about living as Christians. And it's interesting because he talks about in the first couple of verses, those two verses we're so familiar with, present your body as a living sacrifice. Really understand that Christianity is all about giving up of self and giving into the Lord, into his way, and to following him and doing what he says to do. And then you look beginning in verse 3 through verse 8, and he talks about the heading for mine says serve God with spiritual gifts, but I like to look at it from the standpoint of here's rules for life. And he gives us some 4 different rules for life and how to live life and do the things that we're supposed to do. We're all supposed to be given to ministry. While we were at Pomona, I suggested this, and the elders graciously agreed to it. On our bulletin front, now we gave out our bulletins every Sunday. The secretary would fix them, and folks would pick them up every Sunday, much like we do our announcement sheet here. But anyway, on the front, we listed, elders, deacons, and then we listed ministry. And ministers, we said every member. And then we listed preacher, and then that, of course, was my name. And that's what we are. We're all ministers. And we all serve in some capacity, depending upon our talents, depending upon our abilities. And with that being true, that's what Paul says, verses 3 through 8. Do what you can do and do it to the best of your ability. And then beginning in verse 9, he talks about, okay, here's how you're going to behave with regards to others. Here's how you're going to live your Christian profession with regards to others. And he talks about not just others. He says, here's how you're going to live your life, verse 9, with regards to yourself. Let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Then in the 10th verse, he says, here's how you're going to live your life with regards to others. And he says, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. Then he talks about in verse 11, here's how you're going to live with regards to the Lord, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. And then in verse 12, he says, okay, here's the example that you're supposed to set before others. Rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer. And then in verse 13, he says, here's how you live your life before others, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Now, he begins to talk in verse 14, where we began this morning. He begins to talk about how to treat others and how to put good for evil. He says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. We understand persecution. Our persecution is different than the persecution that, say, Paul and the Romans were feeling at their point in time of history. The Romans were highly persecuted or highly persecuted Christians. They did not like Christians, but at the same time, too, it was more that they allowed it to happen than they did it themselves. Rome was pretty much hands off to what we would consider the world. It conquered the world, but it pretty much left its folks. You pay your taxes, and we'll kind of leave you alone. But when you talk about Rome itself, you're talking about governments. You're talking about so many things, culturally, civically, many things going on. And Christians were persecuted. They were put to death. Today, we understand and we see really our persecution, at least in the United States. Now, this is not true everywhere in the world today. But in the United States, we see our persecution as folks laughing at us, folks making fun of us, and folks contradicting everything we say. And we call that persecution, and it is, and it's bad. Don't mean to say that it's not. But there are folks that persecute us. There are folks that persecute us in the church and out of the church. There are folks even in the church that persecute us. What's our response to them? You might say, well, how do they persecute us? Well, they slander our good name a lot of times. What do we do? What's our response? Our response usually is get mad and get even. But that's not what Paul said. He says, bless them. Don't curse them. Bless them. And then he goes on. He says, rejoice with those that rejoice. Boy, that's easy, isn't it? It's easy to be happy with those that are happy, to rejoice with those that rejoice. Don't get around Suzanne today. Why? Because she has 3 pictures of our beautiful grandchild, and that was in the homecoming. 5 pictures. I only have 3 or 4. No, you sent me 5 or something. She has 5 pictures of our beautiful grandchild that was in the homecoming parade at Freed-Hardeman yesterday. Beautiful little Lions or Freed-Hardeman University cheerleading outfit. Just cute as a bug on a rug, but don't get around Suzanne unless you want to see him. Now, if you want to see him, that's fine. But if she doesn't show them to you, come to me. I got them. I'll show them to you. You see, we rejoice with those that rejoice. That's easy. Yeah, you're wrong. But the next is a little bit harder. Weep with those that weep. We don't like to cry. We don't like to cry at all. Paul is talking about the idea of sympathy and empathy. Sympathy with folks that are going through hard times. Being able to sit with folks. You see, here's the scenario. We don't know what to say. Rejoicing's easy because we say, way to go. But when somebody's hurting, we don't know how to respond. What's the correct words? What's the right words? My prayer often to God for me is give me the right words, please. We don't know what to say. We don't know how to feel. And some folks have problems getting to that depth of emotion. Now, there's various reasons, and we could get into all of that, but there's various reasons why some folks have that trouble getting to that depth of emotion. We have to learn to weep with those that weep. Sit with folks. The idea of, I've got to say the right thing. No, you don't. You've heard me say it before. Go back to the book of Job. Job's friends were great while they were sitting there for a week. It was after they opened their mouth that they became miserable companies. But it's still the idea of weep with those that weep. Spend time with them. Love on them. Show them that you care. Show them by your presence. Had a man once that really had trouble showing his emotions. For him to show comfort to others made him very, very uncomfortable. And I watched him sometimes when he needed to weep with those that weep, and he could not. He would just leave. Paul says, learn to be an individual that weeps with those that weep. Be of the same mind, verse 16. Be of the same mind toward one another. The word mind there has the idea of think. Think like one another. Think toward one another. Think for the idea of what's going on in their life. How can I help them? Put ourselves in their shoes for a little while. And imagine. And we're not going to always imagine correctly, right? We're not always, we're going to think, well, they're thinking this, and they may not be thinking that. Or they're going to do this, and they may do that. But we need to maybe spend a little time in our own space, in our own mind, thinking of others and what's going on. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Don't set your mind on high things. Don't go after things that are places of honor. You don't have to seek the presidency of the United States. You don't have to seek places of honor. Sometimes that's all folks are after, places of honor. Paul says you don't have to set your mind on those things. The idea of associate with the humble. The associate is the idea of carried away. Be carried away with the humble. Like the humble, appreciate the humble, be humble of spirit. Humble of spirit doesn't mean you can't laugh, doesn't mean you can't be loud, doesn't mean you can't talk. Humble of spirit is the idea of acceptance. Being able to be, if you will, low in spirit from the standpoint of willing to accept what's going on and around. Now, that does not mean, nor am I trying to say by definition, we accept anything anybody believes or thinks. No. But it's the idea of I'm not arrogant, I'm not haughty, I'm not wanting my way, and it's only my way or bust. Had a man a few years back that told a story on himself and told it many times about when he was in his working days, how that he butted heads with different workers. And as he told the story, he would tell the story of some that would come out fighting mad at him and want to fight him. And he said, the way I stopped them is to ask them this: have you ever thought that your way was wrong? Well, the problem was that man that asked that question always thought everything he did was right. You see, he had a little problem there, but because he couldn't accept anybody else's idea that maybe they were right and he was wrong. We have to understand that humble of spirit, willing to be individual that's pliable. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Don't be deceived by your own wisdom. How smart am I? How good am I? I'm best. No. There's always somebody better. But don't be wise in your own opinion. Something else, because he changes, it's the same, but he changes a little bit how he talks about the rest of this chapter. So anything anybody like to say or ask? Well, how do you react when somebody hurts you? Do you get mad? Do you start to holler? Do you start to scream? Do you start to fuss? Do you start to fight? What do you do? How do you react? Paul gives us an answer when somebody hurts us. Paul tells us, beginning in verse 17, this is how you react when somebody hurts you. First of all, what does he say? Well, let's just kind of read the rest of the chapter and then we'll talk about it. He says, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For in so doing, you'll heap coals of fire upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. How do you, when somebody hurts you, what do? Well, like I say, how do you respond? How do you react? Well, we all know how we react. But here's how Paul says, the Christian, here's how we react. First thing he says is verse 17. He says, think before you respond. The idea of have regard is the idea of think. Think before you respond. When somebody hurts you, before you respond, think about what's going on. Think about the situation. Think about how they feel. Think about what your response needs to be as a Christian, as a child of God. How's the best way to handle this? So Paul says, when somebody hurts you, think. And then he goes on to say, as much as is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Try to get along with everybody. Some folks are harder to get along with than others. Don't ask my wife, because she'd say amen. Some folks are harder to get along with than others. And because of that, we have to put sometimes more effort into certain relationships than we do others. But Paul says here, he says, as much as is possible, as much as depends on you, you live peaceably. Live peaceably. Got a neighbor that does things to you? Got a neighbor that does bad things to you? You know, a neighbor that dumps on your property? You think before you respond, but you try to live as peaceably as possible. Now, sometimes there's going to come a time, hopefully not in your lifetime for you, but there's going to come a time in which you're going to say, I've done everything I can do. I can't do any more. And there are some people like that. You try your best. You try your hardest. And that's what Paul says, if it is possible. Sometimes it's not. You've done everything you can do, and finally you just have to say, that's it. That's the end. I'm finished. I've done all that I can do. Paul says, you need to understand to try to get along with them as best as possible. But then he says in verse 19, he says, don't try to get even with them. Well, they did so and so to me. I'm going to do so and so to them. Soap operas. Oh, I'm fixing to hit somebody on the toes. Soap operas are notorious for that, right? You know, they did something to me. I'm going to do something to them. It's the idea of get even. And it's a never-ending cycle, right? Because we don't often realize we were the first one to take the actions to cause the problem. And I'm not talking about us, but I'm talking about whoever causes the problem. We don't realize a lot of times we were the first ones, and so they get back at us then, and then we think, well, we got to get back at them. We got to get even with them. How can we get even with them? What can I do to destroy them, to hurt them, to make them feel as bad and as miserable as I felt? And we're ultimately miserable trying to think of something that will make them miserable instead of moving on. Paul says, don't try to get even. Do not avenge yourselves. Don't be the one that says, I'm going to get even with them. Well, why not? Because Paul says if it's possible, you're supposed to live peaceably with them. But then he goes on. And he says, allow kindness to dictate your action. Do what's good. If your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. I think I shared with you a story I have of a lady once that just wanted a divorce. And she said, I have tried everything. She said, I have poured water on his head. And she went through this long list of things. I've done this, I've done that. And finally, the judge just said, well, ma'am, have you ever tried to be nice to him? Have you ever tried to smile at him and be kind to him? And she said, no, but I poured hot water on his head one time and it didn't work either. You know, we get to that point. Paul says here, he says, don't allow meanness, but kindness to dictate your actions. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? Because God says, let me take care of it. Let me take care of it. We often think we know what's going on in people's lives and why they made the choices that they made. We do not know what goes on in between the ears of an individual. We may think we know, and we may assume that we know, but we don't know. Many years ago, congregation that I was working with, before I had arrived there to work with them, years before, there was a man that had taken his life. He was a businessman. He was well thought of. I think he was a deacon in the church. He was well thought of in the church. He was well thought of in the community. He had beautiful children. He was just, from what this elder that told me the whole story one day told me, that he was just the most delightful individual. The company that he had ran into some financial problems and there were other difficulties. I won't get into all of it, but there were other difficulties. He came to church, and this elder that was telling me the story said he came to church and he was happier, it seemed like, than he had been in a long time. And he went home and he killed himself. And this elder, as he was telling me this, he said, we didn't know. And I said, well, first of all, if he was happier than he'd been in a long time, there's the first key. He said, why is that? I said, because he was saying his goodbyes and he'd already made up his mind. Counseling, you find out once an individual does that, once they've gone through this lengthy time, and once they've made up their mind, they're going to do it. And I think Jerry Barber has a good one that he tells about a lady that came and she was going to kill her husband, and he asked her these 15 million questions about how she's going to do it, when she's going to do it, and she hadn't decided all that. Well, he said, I don't think you've made up your mind you're going to kill him, so I don't know that I can kill him. But anyway, back to my story. We don't know. We don't know what goes on between people's ears. God has all the inside information. And so Paul says, instead of trying to get even with them, let God take care of that. Let God deal with it. It makes your life a whole lot better. It makes it a whole lot simpler. You get to go about your daily life, do what you want to do the things that you care about doing, the things that you enjoy doing. You don't have to make sure that every aspect of your plan hits the mark that it's supposed to hit. I can tell you about a story, and I won't give a great deal of particulars. I can tell you about a story in congregation working with the time. This man, unfortunately, had a plan. He really believes he got away with his plan, and that's fine. Fact is that I know what his plan was because he left a trail of evidence, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. And I was the one that happened to find the evidence. A little late, but I found it. That man had no clue. Paul says, you want to get along with people? I want you to get along with people. I think one of the best definitions for sin, and we can talk about sin from the standpoint of we can look at Psalms where it talks about blessed the man that walk not in counsel of God, but stands the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. We can talk about Psalm 1. We talk about Psalm 51, where it talks about the three words for sin, iniquity, and transgression. And we can talk about that's what sin is. I think the best definition for sin is what contradicts sonship with God and brotherhood with mankind. In other words, when you look at the Bible deals with the aspects of having that right relationship with God, but it also deals with having that right relationship with one another. And so Paul says, let God take care of it. Do something good for them. Because ultimately, verse 21 answers it. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Don't allow evil to overcome your life and consume your life. But you help overcome evil with good. How do you break the chain? How do you break the cycle? Christians are chain breakers and cycle breakers. They break the chains and break the cycles to make sure that they don't continue. Anything, I say more, but anything else anybody like to say or add? Boy, you're talking about changing subjects. All changing subjects. What do we do with our government? God and government is chapter 13. Boy, that's not all of chapter 13, thankfully. I have my political leanings. You have your political leanings. And those political leanings you have for various reasons, and they may not agree even within the church. Years ago, I had a member of the church that lived right across the street from the church building. It was election time, and he put up a sign in his yard dealing with probably who he was going to vote for, at least who he was supporting. I had a member come to my office, and they were very upset. Why are you upset? I'm upset because the sign that they have in their yard, that person is, and they ran off, all these things. Yes. And I knew how they leaned, and to be honest, I leaned that same way, but I said, but do you consider these problems in this side? I said, there are independents, probably socialists, Democrats, and Republicans in the church. But here's our difference. The church is not a government institution. Church is about the Lord, about people. That's why when we stand up on Sundays, we don't spend time talking about what the president, what Congress, what the House or Senate, what they've done. Now, there are churches that do that. First of all, when we get especially to an election year, it is against the law, this is always interesting to me. When you got churches, probably the best way to frame them. You have churches that the preacher gets up and tells you how to vote. That's against the law. As a nonprofit organization, I can tell you how all sides stand, but I can't tell you who to vote for. Now, if you come up and ask me in the yard, what's my political leanings and where am I politically, I'll talk to you. But from the standpoint of me standing up on Sunday and saying, you got to vote for so-and-so. Well, right now in this area, we do have an election, Senate, Bill Blackburn's seat. I can't tell you who to vote for. Why? Because the law of the land says nonprofits can't do that. But yet there are churches that do. That's why eventually, and let me go off on a side for just a second. That's why eventually, probably, if all things continue as they are in years to come, churches will not be nonprofits. And churches will be taxed. Now, y'all think about that. Not our fault. Not our fault. Inasmuch as we're not a political organization or political figures, we do have, as Christians, a responsibility towards the government. And we live in a democracy, and I'm thankful for that democracy. I'm thankful that I live in a democratic society. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that I have the freedom in Sunday mornings to get up and to come to church and to talk about God in the way that I want to talk about God with folks that believe fairly close. At times we'll probably differ from time to time on things. But from the same point of view, I can do that, and I don't have to worry about somebody coming in and saying, we're going to close you down. We're going to do away with you. We're not going to have you be a part of our community. And we're going to throw you, Christians, in jail. I don't have to worry about that, because I live in a democracy. But one of the things that we're going to see as we enter into this study of these few verses is that Paul does not recommend or even talk about a form of government. But he talks about Christians and the government under which they live. So there's a difference. In other words, the idea that some have pushed forward, and not a lot, this is more small groups, but the idea that some have pushed forward within the last, say, 20 years or so, that this nation will never fall because this is God's nation, is not true. God never said every government of the world must be democratic. Now, like I said, I'm thankful for it, appreciate it. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But God does say something about government. What does he say? What does Paul say? He says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Something we need to catch right here at the beginning is that this is an imperative. This is what God expects. Let every soul. And when you think about that, you say, well, wait a minute, that's not just every Christian, that's every individual. Yes. Do remember to whom Paul is writing. Paul is writing to Christians. Romans chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. But inasmuch as he's writing to Christians, he says, let every soul be subject. The word subject there has the idea of to submit to or to obey. The governing authorities, the governing powers. Where you live, we're subject to the laws of the land. You and I are subject to the laws of the land. May not like the laws. Now, when that law goes against God's law, I think Paul's going to hit it here, and as we move on in this verse, and we have to understand God's law is first. Why? Because any power that exists today is because God has allowed it to exist. Whatever government I live under, I am subject to those laws. I may not like them. I may not like, in the United States, I may not like the percentage, say, of the taxes that I have to pay. I may not like laws with regards to, when I was growing up, this is changed, and you all can talk about it as well. When I was growing up, everybody closed on Sundays. There wasn't anything of things have changed. Then, sort of as that changed, then you couldn't sell alcohol, and you still can't sell alcohol to a certain time in the state of Tennessee, but it's like noon, something like that. Then you start selling it after that. But used to you couldn't sell any of it at all. It was from like midnight to midnight, Sundays. And I'm talking about by the drink. I'm not talking about going into liquor stores. You might say, I don't like those laws. I understand. Those laws were made for a purpose. That's why it's important, I think, for Christians, and I've run into some, I've had some that don't vote. And that's perfectly, I think that's an individual's opinion. You might say, well, they're all crooks. Yeah, they are. And they're all dishonest. Yeah, pretty much. And they all won't do, yeah, I get it. I told one lady one time, she said, I don't vote. And I said, well, I do. She said, you do? I said, yes, ma'am. I said, I vote because I want to be able to gripe and complain. I said, therefore I vote. And she was a sweet, sweet lady. But she hadn't voted. Oh, mercy. She hadn't voted in years at that point. And she was well past the time where she was going to vote, period. But the authorities that exist, they've come from God. Notice that the last phrase there, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. The word appointed there has the idea of they've been assigned or arranged. God has allowed them to be, is the idea. Therefore, let me move on. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So you want to lead a revolt. And there are those in our country today that want to lead that. If you resist the authority, you resist the very ordinance. The word ordinance there has the idea of direction. The arrangement that God has put into order. God is not a God of chaos. God is a God of order. That pretty much is even said with regards to the church and the spiritual gifts of 1 Corinthians. Well, that statement is in 1 Corinthians 14, but 12, 13, and 14. And so he says here, you need to understand that God has arranged the government. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists the direction of God, and those who resist will be brought into judgment on themselves. For rulers, verse 3, are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Now, I know, sometimes we wonder about that, because they just seem to go against everything. And then you say, well, preacher, if you're right in your prediction, and it was the Paul Daugherty prediction, if you're right in your prediction about the churches and the status of which they'll change with regards to the tax law, then what you're saying here is that they are a terror to good works. Well, I get that. But Paul says here the purpose of the government is not tear down good works. And so here's the idea, if you're not doing anything wrong, don't worry. How many of us, I'll raise my hand first, but how many of us have been driving down the road and see a policeman up front and all of a sudden have to slow down? Why? Because we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing. I do like what one preacher said one time. I was riding with this guy, and his father was a missionary. Well, he was a missionary, but he was located at the time. I was riding with Dorian and his dad one time, and his dad said, 5 miles over the speed limit is grace. Anything over that, he said breaking the law, but 5 miles over the speed limit was grace. Well, how many of us? We understand that's a terror, but of good work, no. Paul says here, though, he says, you need to understand that they have rules and we have laws. They're not a terror of good works, but evil. We could sit and talk for a long time about capital punishment. Is it right? Should we do it? Of course, then you get into the idea. Eventually, that evolved into a discussion over whether you should go to war. But here, I think Paul is really talking more about capital punishment. And we have to understand that within the church, there are those that are opposed to capital punishment. And I think if you're opposed to it, you're opposed to it. And I don't think that you're going to hell for the fact that you're opposed to it. I am for it. Now, some will say, well, wait a minute. Isn't that murder? Well, we'll talk about that here in just a second. Some will say, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Capital punishment is not a means of stopping people from breaking the law. How do you know? How do you know? How many people have not broken the law because they're afraid that they'll get caught, thrown in jail, and put to death? We don't. Why? Because remember what we said a while ago? We don't know what goes on between these two ears of individuals. I know one thing that I've thought about a lot, strangely enough. I don't want to break the laws of the land. You know why? I don't think I could exist in jail. Therefore, what is that to me? That is enough fear within me to say, I want to do what the laws of the land say. Paul says here, you need to understand, he says, there's laws that are made, and he says, they're not terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Well, sure. Do what's good, and you'll have praise for the same. For he is a good minister, or for he is God's minister, to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. He, who's the he? Government. In the context here, does not bear the sword in vain. He has a right to punish. If we do not have laws of the land, if we do not have those laws, we become a nation of chaos, lawlessness, chaos. It gets us back to the days of judges, right? When everybody did that which was right in their own eyes. And if we do not have those laws and we have chaos, we can't do anything. And above all, stop and think about it from this standpoint. The church cannot and will not be able to operate unless we have those laws. Those laws then are for our good. I don't like some of them. I'll be honest, I don't like some of them. This idea of right away and I can come in and tear up your property like they've done to here at the church, and you finally, the man that is over it now, you appreciate. He said this should have been taken care of a long time ago with regards to we should have fixed your yard back and so forth and so on. He did it. The man before him didn't care. And he told me he would not leave me stranded, but he did all summer long. This guy fixed it. Laws of the land. Does government have the right to wield the sword? Yes. What the government may or may not do. Let me read you this. I found this somewhere a long time ago. It says what the government may do may be right, even though such act may be wrong. for the individual saint, for the sinner, acting on his own. What the government may do can be allowed. This is this person's take, and I tend to agree with this. The government can do something that I can't do. Now, put that with the idea of capital punishment. If the government can wield the sword, if it can wield it in such a way and in the right way, I cannot, but the government can. Think about it this way. We sit in academia, we sit in ethics classes. I've had to sit in several. You sit in those ethics classes and you debate this idea. Can't put people to death, can't kill people, can't murder people. Well, we can't murder people. Why? Because the Bible tells us not to murder people. Okay. Does that remove all killing? There are some that'll say, well, yes, it does. Well, if it does, then a Christian can't become a policeman, because the average is that policemen will kill at least one person in their time of service. That's the average. You see, a policeman in line of service can have a justified killing. I don't know how the turnout will be for the man that was killed the other day by police, by the Greyhound. But government has a right. Now, you might say, well, I'm past this and I don't like it. And I understand that. Oh, shoot. Brother Baxter, Batson Barrett Baxter. Brother Baxter was a pacifist. I have met his son and have had privilege to talk to his son on a few occasions within the last year and a half. What a joy and what a privilege. His son is not a preacher. His son is a psychologist, doctor of psychology. Very intelligent, very kind individual. He said Dad wrestled with it hard. We were talking about it one day at the preacher's gathering, and he said Dad wrestled with it hard. Well, we have to understand there is a wrestling that has to go on. But does the government have the right? Well, evidently so, from what Paul says. Therefore, verse 5, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. In other words, he says, be subject to the law of the land, not just because you're afraid of getting punished, but notice what he says, but for conscience sake as well. In other words, this is the right thing to do. This is what God commanded. This is the thing we should do. For because of this, you also pay taxes. You know, he could have left that out. Not really. But it would have been nice, wouldn't it? No, we have to pay our taxes. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For they're God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. They are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And he says they're ministers, attending is the idea of adhering to or constantly taking care of this very thing. Now, let me say this before I look at verse 7. I don't have time to spend all I want to on verse 7. Let me say this. There are times in which we are going to oppose our government. There are times in which our elected officials are going to make decisions that we don't like. There are times in which we're going to be able to speak out to those decisions. They give open forums and they give times to speak out. Is it all right to speak out? Yes. Why? Because at that point, nothing is set in stone, so to speak. You're trying to influence something. I mean, I went years ago, I went to a city council meeting with my neighborhood, and I understood one way, my neighbors understood it another, and when I listened to the city council people, or actually listened to the mayor explain it, I understood that I was right, they were wrong. I hadn't argued with my neighbors. I was there actually to support them. But we would have spent time talking about it. But once the mayor explained it to me, or explained it to the group, I understood. Didn't like it, but I understood. And he told us basically to go back and talk to our alderman and see if we couldn't get things changed. So he gave us a platform to do such, and my neighbors weren't that keen on it. So here's the point. Point is that when there are times to debate, we can debate. When there are times in which we're opposed to our government, we need to, because we live in a democracy, we can make that in a peaceful, orderly way known. We can do that, but we still have to fall in the laws that are made. And so therefore, he says, while he's talking about taxes, he says, render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. That's everybody. Pay your taxes. The idea of customs, the idea of taxes or tribute. Honor to whom honor is due. Treat honorably all people. Even those that are scoundrels and those that get us back into the 12th chapter that we don't always like and agree with. I think you pay your taxes. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here. I will tell you a quick story. There was a man in the community that we live that he really opposed government. He was older, so he didn't really bother anybody. He opposed government. City, county, state, federal government. He was opposed to all government. And so he had quit paying his taxes. He quit paying his property taxes, and eventually the county just said, we've thrown him in jail enough, forget it. So they kind of just, and he lived in a dump. Sorry, should not have said that way. He didn't live in the most desirable of houses. They kept throwing him in jail because he wouldn't pay his tags on his car. So the first thing he did was he took his license plate off. They finally threatened to take away his car. So he thought he'd settle it. And he never did get out of town. He drove everywhere around town on his tractor. He thought he'd figured out a way. He was a good guy. He's a little weird, but he's a good guy. But he didn't want to pay taxes. And so that's how he kept from doing it. But it's an interesting story. Anyway, anything else? I've gone over. Yes. Sharia law. Well, that's a great point. And I think it gets back to this idea. The laws that do not inflict upon my faith, I am to support. The law that opposes my faith, I have to ask which is more important, which is first in my life. And my faith is far more important. Well, my faith, there's a good point. Yeah, there's a good point. I can, because of time, but I would concede it anyway. That's a good point. Anything else? Yeah, it's a great question, and like I say, I've sat through ethics classes. I've had to sit through a few, and I've enjoyed every one of them. But it's great thought. Let's bow forward prayer quick. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, for the blessing of it. Thankful for the opportunity that we have to study your word, for what it means to us, for the direction that it gives us, for the life that we're able to live. And we're thankful for the country in which we live. We may not always like the laws and appreciate the laws and those that make them, but we do appreciate the fact that we live in a place where we can come and gather peaceably and enjoy the blessings that are found in worship of you and your word. We ask now that you watch over us, be with us, bless us, and keep us and hold us as we hold you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week. Thank y'all.